In the early decades of the 20th century, long before ancient DNA laboratories existed, and long before scientists could trace human ancestry through fragments of bone powder and molecular sequences, a strange pattern had already begun to emerge from the skulls themselves. An old newspaper clipping from China captured that forgotten atmosphere perfectly. Archaeologists and anatomists working across the Americas kept encountering faces that did not fit comfortably inside the standard image of the first Americans. The skulls looked different. The foreheads sat lower, the faces appeared broader, the eye sockets often deeper, the cranial vaults longer and narrower. Again and again, researchers searching through caves, rock shelters, deserts, and ancient burial grounds reached for the same comparisons. They described certain early American skeletons as resembling Australo-Melanesians, Papuans, or people from the Western Pacific. Those comparisons sounded controversial even then, and over time many scholars quietly pushed them aside. Yet the descriptions never fully vanished. They kept returning from different corners of the continent, attached to different skeletons separated by thousands of miles and thousands of years. Something connected them, and that connection stretched from the caves of Brazil to the flooded caverns of the Yucatan, from Baja California to central Mexico, and deep into one of the strangest genetic discoveries ever uncovered in the Americas. Two skulls discovered near Jokudian, not far from the famous Peking Man locality, were described as resembling Melanesians and even carrying slightly Neanderthal-like features. The language sounds shocking today because modern anthropology became deeply cautious about cranial comparisons. Yet those older researchers were not inventing the similarities from nowhere. They were responding to visible anatomical patterns that repeatedly appeared among certain ancient populations around the Pacific Rim. The skulls from Upper Cave Jokudian possessed long cranial vaults and facial structures that did not resemble the later northern East Asian pattern that dominates much of Eastern Asia today. To many anatomists of the period, they looked unexpectedly southern, unexpectedly generalized, unexpectedly ancient. That same pattern surfaced again decades later in Brazil with the discovery of Lucia. Her skull became one of the most famous human fossils ever uncovered in South America because it immediately reignited the old debate. Lucia did not resemble the later indigenous populations of the Americas in the way many researchers expected. Instead, anthropologists repeatedly compared her cranial form to Australians, Melanesians, and certain African populations. Her face appeared broad and projecting, her skull narrow and elongated, her forehead lower than the rounded vaults more common among later Native American groups. The implications were enormous because Lucia dated to roughly 11,000 years ago, placing her close to the earliest known populations in South America. The deeper researchers looked into Lagoa Santa, the stranger the picture became. Lucia was not an isolated anomaly. Numerous skulls from the region carried similar morphology. The old assumption that the Americas were peopled by one homogeneous founding group moving rapidly southward began to weaken under the pressure of anatomy itself. Scholars such as Walter Neves argued that these early South Americans represented a distinct biological pattern that differed strongly from later indigenous Americans. The morphology looked more generalized and more similar to populations associated with the southern Pacific world. Critics pushed back fiercely, arguing that cranial shape could shift rapidly through drift, nutrition, or adaptation, yet the debate never disappeared because the differences remained difficult to ignore. Then another skeleton emerged from the darkness of a flooded cave in Mexico, and the mystery deepened further. Naya, the teenage girl discovered inside the submerged Hoyo Negro cave system on the Yucatan Peninsula, carried one of the oldest, nearly complete skeletons in the Americas. Her skull again displayed the same generalized Paleo-American pattern that had already become familiar from Lagoa Santa. Researchers immediately recognized the resemblance. Long, narrow vault, broad face, cranial form distinct from later northern Native American populations. Yet Naya also delivered something Lucia never could: ancient DNA. That genetic evidence complicated the story in a dramatic way. Naya belonged genetically to the same broad ancestral lineage as modern Native Americans. Her mitochondrial lineage connected her to the populations that ultimately spread throughout the Americas. In other words, her skull looked different, but her deeper ancestry still linked her to the primary founding population of the New World. This produced a tension that still has not fully disappeared from anthropology. Why did the earliest skulls across the Americas look so different from many later populations if their genetic ancestry ultimately connected back to the same founding source? Part of the answer began emerging from studies involving population Y, one of the most intriguing discoveries in modern genetics. When researchers examined certain Amazonian populations, especially groups deep in the rainforest, they identified faint but statistically significant genetic signals connecting them to present-day Australasian populations such as Papuans and indigenous Australians. The signal was extremely old and extremely subtle, yet it existed. Geneticist David Reich and his colleagues gave this mysterious ancestry the label Population Y, after the Tupi word Ipiquera, meaning ancestor. Suddenly the old cranial observations no longer looked entirely isolated from genetics. The morphology and the molecular evidence began pointing in the same direction. The important detail often misunderstood in popular discussions is that Population Y does not mean ancient Australians sailed directly into South America. The reality is far more complex and far more fascinating. The evidence instead points toward ancient population structure somewhere in Northeast Asia before the settlement of the Americas. The founding peoples who crossed into the New World were not perfectly homogeneous. They already carried different ancestral signals before entering Beringia. Some groups preserved deeper ancestry connected to populations that also contributed to Australasians and Papuans. Those ancient divisions remained faintly visible both genetically and anatomically. This helps explain why so many early skulls across the Americas share that generalized Paleo-American appearance: Lucia Naya, Peñon woman from central Mexico, certain Periku skulls from Baja California, ancient remains from Lagoa Santa. The same pattern repeats again and again: long cranial vaults, broader faces, lower cranial height. Anatomists from earlier generations repeatedly used the word Melanesian because they lacked the genetic language available today. They were describing visible morphology, using the comparisons they understood. The Periku people became one of the most controversial examples of all. Living at the far southern end of Baja California in relative isolation, the Periku retained unusual cranial characteristics that puzzled researchers for generations. Early European observers frequently remarked that they appeared physically distinct from neighboring indigenous populations. Some anthropologists described their skulls as archaic or australoid in form. Others rejected those comparisons as exaggerated typology. Yet the Periku occupied an important geographic position because Baja California represented an ecological refuge zone. Isolation there preserved older traits long after other populations mixed or disappeared. Peñon woman added another crucial layer to the puzzle. Discovered near Mexico City and dating back more than 10,000 years, her skull again displayed the same Paleo-American morphology seen in Lucia and Naya. Researchers repeatedly commented upon the similarities between these early Mexican skeletons and the ancient remains from Brazil. This is important because it reveals that the morphology was not confined to one isolated pocket in South America. It stretched across enormous distances. The same broad anatomical pattern appears from central Mexico to Brazil and into Baja California. What makes the situation even more intriguing is that the early populations carrying this morphology occupied some of the most environmentally challenging landscapes in the Americas. Lagoa Santa groups survived within a difficult tropical environment. The Periku adapted to desert coastlines with limited fresh water. Naya lived during the final stages of the Ice Age, when sea levels remained far lower and the Yucatan cave systems were dry. These were frontier populations existing near the edge of survival, and frontier populations often preserve older ancestry because they remain relatively isolated from later demographic expansions. Over time, later migrations carrying stronger Northeast Asian-derived morphology expanded across the Americas and became dominant. The rounded cranial vaults and facial structures associated with more recent indigenous populations spread widely. Yet pockets of the older Paleo-American morphology persisted for thousands of years. That persistence matters because it suggests these groups were not simply isolated anomalies quickly erased from the landscape. They endured. They interacted. They survived alongside later arrivals for long periods. The old image of a single migration into an empty continent no longer survives intact under the weight of this evidence. Instead, the Americas now appear as the result of multiple dispersals emerging from a deeply structured Northeast Asian population network during the late Ice Age. Some carried ancestry more closely tied to Northern East Asians. Others preserved older lineages connected distantly to populations that later contributed to Papuans and Australasian groups. Those divisions already existed before entry into the Americas. Even the Chinese skulls from Zhoukoudian suddenly looked different when viewed through this broader lens. The old newspaper article appears crude by modern standards, yet the underlying observation fits surprisingly well with what genetics now reveals about deep human population structure across Eastern Eurasia. Ancient Eastern Asia contained far greater diversity than the modern landscape suggests. Some populations carried generalized morphology that later vanished or became absorbed by expanding northern groups. The first Americans emerged from this dynamic and highly diverse world. There is another uncomfortable aspect to this story that anthropology struggled with for decades. The early Paleo-American skulls often looked more morphologically variable than later populations. Researchers did not know how to interpret that variation. Some attempted to force the remains into simplistic categories inherited from 19th century anthropology. Others dismissed the entire issue out of fear that the comparisons themselves sounded politically dangerous. Yet the bones continued telling the same story regardless of academic fashion. The earliest Americans did not look identical to the later populations who eventually dominated the continents. Modern genetics partially resolved the debate while simultaneously making it more complicated. Ancient DNA demonstrated strong continuity between ancient and modern Native American populations in many regions, including Naya herself. Yet Population Y revealed that the founding populations were never biologically simple to begin with. They already carried deep ancestry from multiple ancient branches within Asia. That complexity became magnified as small groups spread across vast territories, isolated themselves, drifted genetically, and adapted to radically different environments. The skulls preserve that forgotten complexity in physical form: a long, narrow vault, a broad, projecting face, lower cranial height, robust jaws. These features do not mean the individuals were Australians or Melanesians literally crossing the Pacific in boats during the Ice Age. They reveal something older and deeper. They reveal that the ancestral populations of Eastern Eurasia once possessed far more diversity than later historical populations preserved. This also explains why certain Amazonian populations still carry faint population Y signals today. Deep within the rainforest, isolated communities preserved ancestry that elsewhere disappeared beneath later demographic expansions. The same process happened physically with cranial morphology. Ancient forms survived longest in ecological margins, isolated refuges, deserts, forests, and difficult terrain where incoming populations mixed less completely. One of the strangest elements of the entire mystery is how long researchers noticed the pattern before genetics finally confirmed part of it. The old anatomists studying Luzia, Penon woman, the Periku, and the Zhoukoudian upper cave skulls lacked molecular tools entirely. They relied only upon careful observation of bone structure. Despite the limitations of their era, they repeatedly recognized the same broad similarities. Modern science eventually circled back towards many of those observations from an entirely different direction. Yet many questions still remain unresolved. Researchers still debate how many migration pulses entered the Americas during the Ice Age. They still debate whether Population Y ancestry entered with the first settlers or arrived during a later movement. They still debate how much cranial morphology reflects genetics rather than environment or developmental plasticity. The debate continues because the evidence refuses to simplify itself neatly. What does seem increasingly clear is that the first Americans emerged from a world of extraordinary human diversity across Ice Age Asia. The ancient populations of Eastern Eurasia were not uniform. They were fragmented, structured, isolated, and constantly shifting across enormous territories shaped by glaciers, deserts, coastlines, and fluctuating sea levels. Some groups carried ancestry connected distantly to the populations that later peopled Papua and Australia. Others became the dominant Northeast Asian ancestors visible today. The Americas became a meeting ground where those ancient lineages survived in unexpected combinations. That is the common thread linking Lutzia, Naya, Penon woman, the Periku, population Y, and the so-called Melanesian-like skulls. They are fragments of an older human landscape now mostly vanished. Their bones preserve echoes of Ice Age populations that no longer exist in pure form anywhere on Earth. The broad faces and elongated skulls are not random curiosities. They are biological shadows from an earlier stage of human expansion around the Pacific Rim. The deeper researchers dig into the earliest layers of American prehistory, the more the old simplified models dissolve. The first settlement of the Americas no longer appears as a clean, linear march from Siberia into an empty hemisphere. Instead, it resembles a tangled web of ancient peoples carrying different ancestries, different appearances, and different histories long before they ever crossed Beringia. Some vanished entirely, others survived only in fragments of DNA. Others remained preserved in caves, cenotes, deserts, and limestone shelters, where their skulls waited silently for thousands of years. Even now, every new discovery threatens to reopen the debate once again. A skeleton from a flooded cave, a fragment of ancient DNA, a skull from an overlooked museum collection, a faint genetic signal hidden deep within Amazonia. The pattern keeps returning because the underlying story never fully disappeared. Something ancient moved along the Pacific edge of Ice Age Eurasia before the Americas were settled. Something diverse, fragmented, and deeply structured. The first Americans inherited that complexity, and traces of it still survive inside the oldest skulls ever discovered in the New World. Thank you for watching.